We all know Dick Turpin is the most famous highwayman of all. Mention the name to most people and they will tell you he was the darling and dashing highwayman who famously rode from London to York on his faithful mare, Black Bess. But if this is what you know, think again. Hi and welcome to the first episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. I'm not a historian or criminologist, just someone with a fascination for historical crimes and history. Each episode will look back to a world of highwaymen, smugglers, thieves and murderers. We'll also delve into mini history bite episodes, looking at the events and social stories that forged the world that these criminals lived in. Before we begin, I have to say I'm so grateful to the numerous historians whose books and online articles make this podcast possible to compile. I'm also grateful to the Guildhall Library in London, in which many happy hours have been spent trawling through old books. So, when we read or talk about history, we have to begin by having to ask ourselves, is there any reason why we can't just reinvent history? And how can we be sure that all the historical events that we believe is fact actually happened? Indeed, the first recorders of all events, characters, figures that we know so well, might have just added embellishments, a wee bit of glamour, or just downright lies. So perhaps, unless other original sources emerge, we will never know. But to be honest, sometimes do we really want to? If we've been taught anything by the silver screen, it is that films and TV, since their invention, either have played loose or completely rewritten historical events and characters to the point of actually being sued. But historians have been doing the same for hundreds of years. The truth is, sometimes, why bother with the truth when you can provide an entertaining story? Turpin didn't have a horse called Black Bess, and he was far from a dashing highwayman. Most of what we grew up believing about Turpin was fictionalised and romanticised in a novel written 100 years after his death. And why? Simple. Because the Victorians, just as we still do, wanted to rewrite our heroes to suit our ideals. In reality, Turpin's fictional Great Ride was actually made by 17th century highwayman John Swift Nick Nevison, who early one morning in 1676 robbed a homebound sailor on the road outside Gad's Hill in Kent. Deciding he needed to establish an alibi, Nevison took off on a ride that took him 15 hours and over 190 miles. It was only at the very end of his life, while waiting to be hanged at York Racecourse, that Turpin exhibited any of the swaggering nonchalance or heroism that he's best remembered for. Prior to that, both his existence and his criminal exploits had been squalid and downright thuggish, to say the least. In order to have any criminal enterprise, you need a criminal environment. What the highwaymen had was miles and miles of desolate and unprotected roads. We have a mental picture in our minds of the Romans coming to England, building settlements across the land, and then building roads enabling easy travel between these cities and towns. However, this was far from the case, and the 17th and 18th century is called the Golden Age of highwaymen. Roads were in such disrepair, quagmires in the wet season and hard wheel breakers in the dry season, it's no wonder that coaches travelled so slowly and made such easy targets. The first official stagecoach routes had first commenced in the 1600s and at first only covered the shorter distances linking nearby towns. By the late 1600s, there were a few longer routes between such places as London and York and London and Exeter that were served by coaches in the summer months only. In 1658, a trip from London to Exeter took 4 days. The trip stopped at a series of coaching inns along the way and advertised departure times. If you got a train today at London Paddington, you could be in the centre of Exeter just over 2 hours later. The chief problem from the point of view of the poor was the cost, with fares for inside carriage passengers being typically 4 or 5 pence a mile, and for outside carriage passengers 2 or 3 pence. It was definitely the inside passengers that highwaymen were targeting. The coaching inns were infested with men who were employed by the highwaymen who would watch out for potential rich passengers and let the waiting highwaymen know a few miles down the road. Because of the state of the roads and the speed of the carriages, there was no way to escape these highwaymen. An idea of just how bad these roads were for carriages comes from an account of Charles III of Spain's visit to England in 1702. Quote, "We set out at 6 in the morning by torchlight to go to Petworth. It did not get out of our carriages, save for when we were overturned or stuck fast in the mire, till we reached our journey's end. The last 9 miles of our way cost us 6 hours to conquer them." This is a description of a 40-mile journey that took 14 hours. It's little wonder that coaches made good targets for these highwaymen. It was noted that Sunday travelling was even more expensive. The hire of horses was doubled, and the toll gates in the outskirts of London charged 2 or 3 times their usual charges. Brighton by now had become a fashionable resort, and it was the first place in which a coach ran to London on a Sunday. Expensive though it might be to travel on this day, some people would still do it, as highwaymen were taking their weekly rest. The roads were safe from their attentions, as they did not consider it worth their while to ride out on a Sunday. 1706 is the year Thomas Twinings acquired Tom's Coffee Shop in Devereux Court near the Strand. In 1717, he opened his own famous tea shop in the Strand, where it continues to this day. Queen Anne is on the throne, by all accounts sickly and dull-witted, with a fondness of booze. She's the last of the House of Stuarts, despite having been pregnant 17 times, but have no surviving children. Richard Turpin was born in 1706 in Essex, the son of John Turpin, a farmer and keeper of the Crown Inn. For any foreign listeners, Dick is a shortened version of Richard. Dick served an apprenticeship with a butcher in Whitechapel, in those days a village on the fringes of the capital. According to the butcher, during his apprenticeship Turpin acted in a disorderly manner. When his apprenticeship was over, he opened his own butcher shop, but began to steal sheep, lamb and cattle. Caught in the act of stealing 2 oxen, he fled to the depths of the Essex countryside. He then tried his hand at smuggling, but proved as inept at this as he had at cattle rustling. Before long, customs agents compelled Turpin and his smuggling gang to lay low. While most people think of Dick Turpin as a lone highwayman, for the majority of his criminal career he was a member of gangs. He joined the Gregory Gang in the early 1730s. They were a well-known gang of deer thieves. Members of the gang are known to have included Jasper Gregory, Jeremy Gregory, Samuel Gregory, Thomas Barfield, Mary Brazier, John Fielder, Herbert Haynes, John Jones, James Parkinson, Joseph Rose, Thomas Rowden, Ned Rust, William Saunders, Dick Turpin, Humphrey Walker and John Wheeler. The gang had the option of operating in a pact or separating into various units. Deer poaching had long been endemic in the Royal Forest of Waltham, and in 1723 the Black Act, so called because it outlawed the blackening or disguising of faces while in the forest, was enacted to deal with such problem and made them a hanging offence. While still deer poaching, the Gregory brothers and the gang usually attacked isolated farmhouses, terrorising and torturing the female occupants into handing their valuables over. A typical attack took place in Loughton, in Essex, where Turpin heard of an old widow woman rumoured to keep at least £700 in the house. When the woman resisted all threats to discover the money's hiding place, Turpin hoisted her into an open fire and burned her bare skin until she gave up all her money. The woman was in such agony that of course she did hand over her money, but she was crippled thereafter for life. £700 was a huge sum of money, but the gang soon squandered it on drink, women and gambling. But it was the age-old adage of the criminal: easy come, easy go. By October 1734, several of the gang had been captured and hanged. The remaining members moved completely away from poaching. They took to just raiding homes. A spree of robberies took place in the whole Essex area, the newspapers reporting that they raided a house of a grocer named Peter Split at Woodford. 2 nights later they struck again, at the Woodford home of a gentleman named Richard Woolridge, a furnisher of small arms at the Office of Ordnance at the Tower of London. On the 19th of December, Turpin and 5 other men raided the house of Ambrose Skinner, a 73-year-old farmer from Barking, leaving with an estimated £300. The attacks continued, their reputation inviting more and more newspaper headlines and notoriety. The gang spread out and moved to various locations in and out of London. For a time, Turpin stayed in Whitechapel before moving to Millbank. They lay low for a while. On the 4th of February 1735, he met John Fielder, Samuel Gregory, Joseph Rose and John Wheeler at an inn along the Broadway in London to plan some more attacks. They planned to rob the house of Joseph Lawrence, a farmer in Edgware. Late in the afternoon, they burst into the house armed with pistols. They tied up the 2 maidservants and brutally attacked the 70-year-old farmer. They pulled his trousers round his ankles and dragged him around the house, but Lawrence refused to reveal the whereabouts of his money. Turpin and the gang started beating Lawrence with their pistols. They emptied a kettle of hot water over his head and forced him to sit bare buttocked on the fire. They then pulled him around the house by his nose and his hair. Gregory took one of the maidservants upstairs and raped her. But for all their trouble, the gang escaped with a haul of less than £30. The gang proceeded to rob their way around the local counties, employing torture as a favoured weapon of persuasion. By 1735, the London Evening Post regularly reported the exploits of Turpin and his Essex gang, and the king had offered a reward of £50 for their capture. According to the National Archives, this would be the equivalent of 7 horses, or 10 cows, or 500 days' wages from skilled workmen. You could see how tempting this would be for the ordinary people. On February the 11th, 1736, local constables captured 2 of the gang, including John Wheeler. Wheeler gave descriptions of the gang. They were circulated in the press. In the London Gazette, Turpin was described as Richard Turpin, a butcher by trade. He's very much marked with smallpox, about 5'9" high, and lived some time ago in Whitechapel, but did lately lodge around Millbank, Westminster. Wears a blue-grey coat and a natural wig. The gang started to tumble. 6 days later, Rose, Brazier and Walker were captured whilst late-night drinking. The Gregory brothers were captured not long afterwards. Turpin, it turns out, narrowly missed capture by bursting out of a window. With the newspapers celebrating the demise of the Gregory gang, Turpin turned to what he's known best for. He teamed up with a highwayman called Thomas Rowden before they committed numerous highway robberies in the London area. Turpin's reputation was growing. Newspapers referred to him as Turpin the Butcher, and he now had £100 bounty on his head. In July 1736, Rowden was convicted of passing false coins and sentenced to transportation. Turpin then left London and headed back to East Anglia, lying low until March 1737. He then began working with Captain Tom King, one of the best-known highwaymen of the day, and the kind of swashbuckling devil-may-care character which would later be Turpin legend. From a cave in Epping Forest, in which they could watch the road without being seen, they robbed virtually anyone who passed their hiding place. Local peddlers started carrying weapons for protection. By March 1737, they were working alongside another highwayman, Stephen Potter. The trio were responsible for a string of robberies in the following months. This ended suddenly at an incident in Whitechapel after King had stolen a horse near Waltham Forest. Its owner, Joseph Major, reported the theft to Richard Bayes, landlord of the Green Man public house in Leytonstone. Bayes, who would later write a biography of Turpin, tracked the horse to the Red Lion at Whitechapel. Major identified the animal, but as it was late evening and the horse had not yet been collected by their new owners, they collected a few men and held a vigil. When Tom King and Potter came to collect the horse, they were captured. Turpin, who'd been waiting nearby, rode towards the men holding King and fired at them. Unfortunately, the bullet hit King, who subsequently died of his injuries. By now, the Turpin bounty was increased to £200. He was well known in many areas of London and beyond to many who would be happy to collect this reward. Realising that he could not long escape capture if he remained in London, Turpin set off for Yorkshire and left his highwayman days forever behind him. He settled in Yorkshire under the name John Palmer, financing his fancy lifestyle with frequent excursions into Lincolnshire for more horse and cattle rustling. One day, returning from an unsuccessful hunt, he shot his landlord's rooster. When the landlord complained, he threatened to kill the landlord as well. He was taken into custody while local authorities made inquiries into how just exactly Mr. Palmer made his money. Inevitably, the constables learned that several outstanding complaints were made against John Palmer for sheep and horse stealing in Lincolnshire. Turpin waited in the dungeons of York Castle while these charges were investigated. But even then, things might not have gone too badly for him if he hadn't written a letter to his brother requesting him to procure an evidence from London that would give me a character that would go a long way towards me being acquitted. Unfortunately for Turpin, his brother was too mean to pay the 6p postage due, and the letter was returned to the local post office. There, by a remarkable coincidence and Turpin's doom, Turpin's former schoolmaster, Mr. Smith, saw it and recognised the handwriting as Dick Turpin's. He had taught Dick to read and write. He took the letter to the local magistrate and with his permission opened it. Despite the fact it was signed John Palmer, Smith identified the writer as Turpin. Smith was subsequently dispatched to York to make a positive identification, and which he did. Convicted on 2 indictments, Turpin was sentenced to death. Pleas from his father to have his sentence commuted to transportation fell on deaf ears. Between his sentence and execution, visitors flocked to Turpin's cell and he was a minor celebrity. He bought new clothes and shoes and hired 5 mourners for 10 shillings each. Then, on the morning of 7th of April 1739, Dick Turpin rode through the streets of York in an open cart, bowing to the gawking crowds. At the Knavesmire, which is present-day York racetrack, he climbed the ladder to the gibbet and then sat for half an hour chatting to the guards and the executioner. An account in the York Courant of Turpin's execution notes his brashness even at the end. Quote, "With undaunted courage looked about him, and after speaking a few words to the topsman, he threw himself off the ladder and expired in about 5 minutes. It was thus in death at least Turpin attained some of the gallantry that had eluded him in life. Mr. Smith, meanwhile, collected the £200 reward. And that would have been the end of Dick Turpin, lost to time, except to historians, as his story was recounted in the Newgate calendar. However, Turpin's legend was reborn in 1834 with the novel Rookwood by Harrison Ainsworth. In this novel, a now heroic Dick Turpin performed all sorts of gallant deeds with his horse Black Bess as a secondary character. Ainsworth's description of an epic ride from Westminster to York caught the popular imagination. It turned a fairly average potboiler into a runaway bestseller. During the years, replays of the Turpin story, as told by Ainsworth, appeared in magazines, cheap novels, ballads, TV, not just in Britain, but around the world. History, romance and legend rapidly blurred, and eventually the fictional ride of Ainsworth Turpin totally eclipsed the villain's real exploits. The transformation of Dick Turpin, housebreaker, torturer, murderer, horse stealer, and all-round nasty piece of work into Dick Turpin, highwayman and knight of the road was complete. And to think, if history had turned out differently, there might just be a small, anonymous, faded grave somewhere in York marked out to a person called John Palmer. By the late 18th century, the golden age of the highwayman was over due to a number of factors. These included the continued urbanisation leading to fewer isolated stretches of roads, a Bow Street horse patrol actively targeting highwaymen, and the development of banking, which meant people carried less money and valuables. Well, that's it for the first episode of the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. If you enjoyed it, please click on the subscribe button and leave a review. Also, tell your friends. Also, find me on Facebook and Twitter under the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast.